Welcome, everyone. As we all know, this meeting is being held virtually, hosted by the Utah Department of Health, Center for Medical Cannabis in Salt Lake City, Utah. Public notice of this meeting was provided as required under Utah's open meeting laws, and it was posted on the Utah Public Notice website. In compliance with Utah's open meetings law, this meeting is being recorded. A recording of this meeting will be posted to the Utah Public Notice website no later than 3 business days following the date of this meeting. Written minutes will also be prepared of this meeting. Approved minutes will be posted to the Utah Public Notice website no later than 3 business days after board approval. So just a reminder, the purpose of the Cannabis Research Review Board is to review the available research literature and assist the Utah Department of Health and Center for Medical Cannabis in their efforts to provide useful treatment recommendations to qualified medical providers regarding the use of cannabis and cannabinoid products for treatment of certain medical conditions identified as qualifying medical conditions. Just another reminder, the key components of a medical program are a comprehensive body of knowledge and standards to ensure an ethical and principled practice, education for practitioners that is accessible and evidence-based, and means of continuously improving care, optimizing outcomes, and mitigating harms to help further our collective understanding of the scientific basis of illness, disease, and applied clinical practice. And finally, we welcome any visitors to our virtual meeting. If you are logged into the meeting with a phone number and not a name, please state your name now so that we can add your name to the meeting minutes. I'm going to give a couple minutes. Rachel, you tell me if there's anyone that needs to share their name with you.
I think we only need to know their name during the comment period. Are you able to see the slideshow though? Is that showing up?
Yep, slideshow's showing up.
Yes, that's correct. We only need to know people's names if they provide a comment and their
okay. So even if they just have a phone number in the screen.
Yeah, if they make a comment, then that's when they chime in with their name and such.
Okay, so we probably need to revise that. I printed off these intro slides, so maybe we can revise that for the next meeting. And we will have the public comment period at the conclusion of this agenda. And just select the raise your hand function appearing at the bottom right of the screen. And we will do our best to accommodate your request to make a comment. And at that time, state your name, affiliation, and any disclosures related to financial interests that you would like to address. And the comments should relate to the agenda and the duties of the board if possible. Comments will be limited to 2 minutes per person. And in an effort to ensure that as many people as possible can share their comments, we will be taking comments one after another, and the board and staff will hold responses until the end of the entire comment period. So we'll stop the meeting at 1:30, take comments, and then leave some time for responses at the very end. Okay, did I do it, Rachel?
Although I think 10:30 is when we'll stop the meeting.
Did I say 10? Okay, I don't even know what I said, but that is
You're
correct.
All good.
Okay. All right, so I think we can get started. So I'm hoping that everyone had a chance to review the minutes. Now would be the time to suggest any revisions or corrections before we approve them.
This is Misty Smith. I would actually move to approve the minutes as they're written. I didn't have any changes.
Thanks,
Second
Misty.
that.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Okay, all in favor of approving, raise your hand or say aye. And all opposed, please state opposed now or raise your hand. Okay. Minutes are approved. So just a reminder, thanks everyone for contributing to that annual report. We are now just waiting for approval from the department, and we anticipate that that will happen by November 1st. And Rich and Rachel can correct me if that's changed since Friday. Okay.
Yep.
So thank you again to everyone. Perry's not able to make it today, but he helped quite a bit with this. And so thank you to Perry as well. All right, well, let's just keep moving ahead. We appreciate you, Mike Moss, agreeing to talk to us about any updates. No pressure, but if you have any updates related to highway safety and cannabis use, please let us know.
Yeah, so I decided to reach out to me the other day about this, and we haven't even had any further meetings. That group doesn't meet until next month again, when I won't be there, and I won't meet with them until January. But I decided what I'd do is I'd take a few minutes just to kind of give the landscape of what is out there as far as cannabis and impairment, sort of a introduction to the problem for the board, and then use that time for a little bit of questions that anyone on the board might have about it, just to kind of set the, at least my perspective on where we're at and things there. And look, I'll share my screen if someone, I guess you're sharing your screen. I have a few slides to share with everybody if I can share my screen.
I think, Rachel, you have to stop sharing yours.
And then, Mike, I just have to, there we go. Oh, great.
It already let me out. You didn't have to give me permission or anything, it looks like. So. Okay, so just a few slides on cannabis and driving impairment here. This is my take-home point, that if we look at experimental data and population level things, we can see that cannabis and driving don't mix. This is a very complicated topic, and so there's a lot of pieces to this, but the bottom line is, like many other drugs, cannabis can cause impairment in various domains of how we move and think, and of course driving being one of the most important for safety of individuals and for the population at large. Here's just some of the issues in this that make this a really difficult topic to know who is impaired and when are they impaired, and when can you tell if they're impaired or not, because this isn't a simple topic. Right, there's a difference in impairment between occasional and chronic users, that someone who uses cannabis frequently may have the amount of THC in their blood that would definitely be impairing for someone who is an infrequent or only occasional user of cannabis, where that occasional user would clearly be impaired, but the chronic user has no evidence of impairment at that same level. So that's a very difficult question, because we know cannabis persists in blood and in body tissues for quite a long time, and can be there for a long time, even after someone has stopped using cannabis completely, when they're not experiencing any effects from it that they would report, but there's still a measured amount in their blood that could seem quite high compared to an occasional user. An additional trouble is a lot of this research that has been done because marijuana is a Schedule I drug, that a lot of this is done using, and all the US-based research is done using NIDA, marijuana cigarettes, joints. You have to use these 2% THC cigarettes supplied by NIDA, grown in, I forget where, Louisiana or Mississippi or something. And it is 1970s Cheech and Chong quality weed that is not anything to do with the 20% THC products that we have now. And so the doses that people are using may be far higher now compared to what most of the research, even research that's being done right now, just because of the laws, mean that they're using legal cannabis in these studies. So that's tough. On one hand, that just means impairment might just be worse, but we know there's some studies that are mixed with that don't show impairment. And so is the answer the dose wasn't high enough? Who knows? Most everything that when we think about driving impairment and the way you study it and the way you set up a little driving simulator on a computer is all based around what we know about alcohol. And THC is not alcohol, right? And so measuring impairment is different. The way what actual piece of your driving, is it your attention? Is it your motor skills? Is it your response time? All of those things may not be the same for THC as for alcohol. And then we have a difference between the route of administration, right? For alcohol, this is straightforward. With rare exception, alcohol is generally just ingested. But for THC, we might have patients who are taking an edible, or something could be in a capsule, or it's vaped or smoked, and that changes the delivery to the brain, and then thus the timing and the course of the impairment. Other pieces I didn't put on here is we don't have field sobriety tests. Touch your finger, walk in a straight line. That's also based around alcohol, and can those tests adequately find impairment from THC? A lot of this you could also say about many other drugs, right? Whether it be prescription benzodiazepines or opioids or anything else that is sedating, though we don't have as much information, and alcohol is kind of king, and then everything else is a bit nebulous about how impairment actually happens. And so THC definitely falls into that realm of it's really hard to know who's impaired when. So that's kind of the overview, and I wanted to show a couple other sort of supporting slides. We could talk about like each of these bullet points for an entire lecture, an entire talk, and there are dozens of papers out there about all of these to look at all the differences and things. I just want to briefly go over metabolism because this is a big component of why this is difficult. Recall that THC, the main psychoactive component, they're recognizing, right, there are dozens of things going on, is metabolized to 11-hydroxy-THC, which is still active, and then finally to the inactive carboxy-THC or THC acid, as I have here, THC-COOH, with that final one being inactive. This little figure is nice and confusing, but it's also kind of, I like that it's confusing because it just tells a tale of how much is going on when someone uses cannabis and how do you have to try to interpret this. So when you drink alcohol, right, it goes up and then it's eliminated from your body at a constant rate after. Makes things pretty straightforward, right? THC is all over the place. So this is showing levels of THC and carboxy-THC in smoking and ingested exposures. So you can see THC goes up rapidly, right, when you're smoking, right? This isn't exactly the scale, this is over hours. And that's the red dashed line here, up and then falls rather quickly. You can see this blue dashed line here is the carboxy-THC that is then elevated for hours and goes very slowly. In contrast, this purple dot here, the single oral exposure, the THC actually only rises a tiny bit, because so much of it is metabolized by the liver before it ever hits the body. What's not shown here is 11-hydroxy-THC, which has a higher peak. But then you can see the THC COOH, the inactive form, even has a higher peak in oral exposure. And so these are kind of flip-flopped between inhaled and oral. So if you were trying to measure this in someone who was driving erratically, you could have vastly different things depending on the timing and whether they smoked or whether they inhaled it. And then to make it even worse, if you are using THC daily, multiple times a day, even if you haven't used for many hours the day before, your THC COH levels may be way up here, higher than any of these others. And that further complicates what's going on, right? Even our, well, I guess I won't go alcohol there because alcohol gets complicated. We've simplified alcohol in our laws, but alcohol is more complicated than that. But this just goes to show you that there's a lot of moving pieces up and down depending on timing and frequency of use and the route of exposure. Here's a, hopefully this doesn't cover too much with the pictures at the side. You can minimize all the faces over there. But here's one nice example of experimental data. There are many of these. Some of these measure different things. They do it in different ways with different doses and different people and different timing. And they've had some mixed results, but I think this one is a good example. This is measuring a very, very common measure in driving impairment called SDLP, or standard deviation of lateral position. So as you are going down the freeway, as you notice the person in front of you all the time, I'll look at them, they're weaving in and out of that lane, right? And here's what's going on. You see the car going back and forth, and the farther you go to the left, the farther you go to the right, and then you measure and average that out. And then how much do you deviate on average from that dead center line is a measure. And if you drink alcohol, that's going to get worse and worse. You're going to be going back and forth across the lane. It turns out THC can do some of the same things. So this is just one way of many sort of pieces that you can measure of how someone is driving. And here's one with THC. These are not huge quantities. These are like 20 milligrams of THC smoked in a 2% nidus joint. So there's not a lot. These 0, 100, 200 are like micrograms per kilo of THC that someone is getting. And then they do it with or without alcohol to reach a blood alcohol of about 0.07. As a reminder, our blood alcohol cutoff in Utah is 0.05. The rest of the country is 0.08. Why did they choose 0.07? It's probably because that's about where they ended up. And then they said, this is where we ended up when we gave people a drink. And the higher the number here, the worse a driver you are. Hopefully the faces and things aren't coming up, but all the way on the right side, you can see the worst impairment is when you combine alcohol with the highest amount of THC. Without alcohol, the highest amount of THC does increase you from 0, the baseline over here at the far left. And you can see that alcohol alone, which is this one, also causes impairment. But when you combine alcohol and cannabis together, they're worse than either one alone. So that's why I like this study in this figure, is it kind of elegantly shows that, yep, there's some impairment with THC. We definitely know there's impairment with alcohol, but when you combine alcohol and THC, things get even worse than if you had used either one alone. They kind of add on top of each other. Here's a completely different study. This is from Australia. This is a little bit old. Like I said, it's been studied for decades, and so there's papers old and new and in between. Looking at drivers who were found responsible in fatal car accidents in Australia. And they looked at the amounts of THC or THC plus alcohol. And the thing to look at here is the odds ratio in this middle column. And so a higher number means increased odds that you were found at fault in a fatal accident based on your urine drug test results. Or actually, this was even serum, sorry, because we're talking about 5 nanograms per ml, about blood test results. So you can see that having a THC above 5 nanograms per ml puts you at a higher odds compared to just THC if you established a higher cutoff. If you included this plus alcohol, it was also high. What they don't show you here is alcohol alone in this table, but they have it elsewhere in this paper, and it was pretty similar to THC alone. So alcohol alone, THC alone had kind of similar risk for being found at fault in a fatal collision. You can see there's a pretty wide interval on their confidence around this, and I think that reflects a lot of the variability in who is actually impaired with that level of THC. To provide some counter argument is something like this. And so here is US fatalities over a 20-year period. This is a bit old, down to 2013, so the landscape would be very different now with the number of states that have changed. But what they did is they looked at years since medical marijuana legalization. So medical marijuana legalization, MML, and that's the black diamonds, and then the lighter kind of X here are states that didn't have it. And you can see that highway fatalities actually went down in the before and after period, adjusted for whenever the date actually was for each of those states when they had medical marijuana. You're like, that's curious. medical marijuana makes people drive better. And one of their hypotheses is that when people use cannabis, they tend to stay at home. They're not going out to bars. They're not going out for drinks. They're not going out to a party. And maybe there are fewer people consuming alcohol, and more people staying at home and then not driving when they use cannabis. So that could be an argument in favor of cannabis, right? That people will tend to use less of other substances that are worse, which is probably one of the major drivers behind having a medical cannabis program, that cannabis is better and has some fewer effects compared to some other things out there. Not that we prescribe patients alcohol or cannabis, but if there is a decrease in the amount of opioids or amount of alcohol that someone uses and uses cannabis instead, and that also causes fewer driving accidents, then that's a good thing. And then a little bit on the impairment, right? We have a number, right? If your blood alcohol is above 0.05 and you were weaving down the highway, then you are guilty of driving under the influence in Utah. It doesn't matter what you look like or what you said. If your blood alcohol is above 0.05, that's above 0.08 in the rest of the country. Just changing the units, that's 50 or 80 in these other commonly used units. And that's pretty well shown that above 0.05, impairment really starts to pick up. The rest of the US doesn't like it, but in fact, Utah's alcohol law is very good, and it should be at 50 in my opinion, because impairment does start low. It's not that you're going to be heading the wrong way down the freeway at 0.05, but your response time is not good as soon as you start getting above fairly mild levels. That's not the point of this talk. This is, what about THC? We actually have no idea. My real consensus, my bottom line for this here. There's some states that are zero tolerance. That is Utah and our famous metabolite law, though we now have in there, if the only metabolite is the THC, carboxylic acid, THC, COOH, then that does not imply an impairment. And that if you're using this as a medical cannabis patient, you have some affirmative defense there. Some states have per se laws, that is a cutoff like alcohol, such as a level of 5 nanograms per ml. Some have used 2 nanograms per ml as far as trying to come up with an absolute cutoff. Others just simply say you can't drive if you're, quote, under the influence as determined by a law enforcement officer. Oregon has that rule, for instance. They don't have a cutoff, but if you are driving erratically and then you have cannabis in your blood and you look like you were impaired, then you're impaired, which is a bit nebulous, but that's the law. So it's really complicated for a lot of those factors that I mentioned of timing and what did you use and how much did you use. And you can try to look at ratios, like, well, if they smoked and the THC is this high and the carboxylic acid is this high, then the exposure must have been recent, therefore they're more likely to be impaired. And if you use this cutoff or whatever else, and no one has figured it out. Plus, you need blood. We don't have a cannabis breathalyzer, right? Alcohol is very volatile and it gets into your breath. And so you can breathe into the breathalyzer and have that measured. There's not an equivalent thing for THC. We've tried some saliva sampling. People are trying to do a breathalyzer version, but what happens of smoking versus ingestion and everything else. So this is very unsettled science as far as determining if someone is impaired at the roadside. We can tell in a controlled driving simulator. When we know exactly when someone got some, we can measure it specifically. We know the dose they got, the time, and everything else, and before and after. But it's very complicated. So my bottom line here is THC does cause impairment, though it's really hard to know who that person is and which person will be impaired at what time. Certainly combining THC with alcohol or any substance with alcohol will make your impairment worse. The overall impact on the population level can be confounded by these other factors of maybe decreased driving, though you could say as cannabis use becomes more accepted, are more people going to go out on the weekend and smoke. If you visited any state that is not Utah and drive down, or in any metropolis, you will smell cannabis absolutely everywhere you go in downtown areas. And so people are obviously out and about using cannabis in different ways than they used to. And though I didn't include a specific slide here, impairment certainly lasts 2 to 4 hours for inhalation. It probably kicks out an additional 2 hours for oral. And then again, it's hard to know on any individual person whether they are impaired or not. And fortunately, people who use cannabis actually feel impaired quite readily, and they feel scared to drive. Doesn't mean they don't drive, but usually they're at least more aware than an equivalent patient who's been using alcohol, who may feel like I'm a better driver when I'm drunk. You'll hear that from people. Fortunately, people who are using cannabis don't think that. They, in fact, think they are a worse driver, which is nice. And they tend to drive more slowly, but their reaction times are also poor. So like I said, this is a complicated topic, but the best global recommendation we could come up with is that people should use caution with driving after using cannabis use, and especially oral products are going to delay that, and it's probably in the neighborhood of 6 to 8 hours, though this is a much more difficult thing to answer than alcohol, for instance. So that's here's a couple references. We could list dozens and hundreds of references about all this, but that's kind of my quick take on this, and I'd be happy if any of the board has questions to talk about this. So my point was just to kind of lay the landscape of what is out there about this and show that it's a difficult question, even though we do know there is evidence for THC causing impairment.
Thank you, Mike. That's really helpful, really informative. I would also like to know if anyone on the board or in the department has any comments or questions. I have one, but I'll wait.
This is Dr. Z. Could you go back to the slide where it shows the data that suggests that alcohol makes THC driving worse?
Yeah. So here's one. This is a little confusing because it's presenting multiple things in one area here. So do you have a specific question you want to look at?
No, I was just trying to understand the data, and
yeah.
So
Yeah, and they don't include their levels of significance here because I think technically like these two are not statistically different, but when you compare the 200 group down to the 0, then it is. And so that's not all included here. And it's kind of weird of like, which one is the negative? You know, here, this is no THC, no alcohol. This is no THC, yes, alcohol, and then different combos. So the way it's laid out is a little funny, but the biggest one is the biggest bar is the most alcohol and the most THC. It's the bottom line for this one.
Yeah, it'd just be helpful to see the stats, but I understand.
Yeah. No, for sure. There's so much to pull out of all of these, and you can these papers all have 5 different tables of all the different measurements for all the different individuals, and so this is kind of one figure to kind of just show the escalation as you increase one or both of what happens.
Thank you.
I had a question actually on the next slide, the Australian study. And I think I'm misinterpreting because that row that has the THC only greater than 5 nanograms per milliliter that shows the odds ratio 6.6. Is that's THC without alcohol, and yet the odds ratio is higher than a BAC of greater than 0.01. Help me to understand
so
that.
this is so right here, this is THC plus blood alcohol of greater than 0.01 or 100 here versus the blood alcohol alone. So this is the adding THC on top of alcohol for this line. And this one is THC by itself. So I think this one is trying to show then that, and yeah, it doesn't, you're like, wait, isn't alcohol even worse? And there's another line that's not shown in here, like I said, is alcohol alone, which is actually in this data set pretty similar to THC with recognizing pretty big confidence intervals.
Yeah, and that was my question. It doesn't look like the 2.7 versus the 2.9 is significantly different, but I'm trying not to get into the weeds, but I guess.
Yeah. And like, you can see all these ends here, like 50, 40 patients, right? These are fairly small ends in the grand scheme of things of the number of accidents we're comparing. So this isn't even hundreds or thousands of accidents. This is 50 drivers, 40 drivers, 40 drivers. So this is small study. But it's not huge. There's more stuff out there now. I'd like to see all of these papers now done again in 2022 with the amount of recreational cannabis and medical cannabis that's out there, and we could pull more and more of these up. So this is, like I said, this is not clear cut, right? There are like, well, this odds ratio is not terribly different from alcohol, but alcohol is supposed to be worse, but there's some signal here. I think more of a take home is showing the higher levels of THC were associated with a greater odds compared to just having a quote positive, like any positive amount of THC. So that was a take home for me out of this one. And then also showing that they don't have in this table, though it's in the other spot, is that it's at least in a similar realm as far as alcohol by itself, which you could also kind of see in this one. Well, here's alcohol by itself, and then here's cannabis by itself. And so this study even had a similar thing of similar levels of impairment. This also depends on weight. Well, exactly how much alcohol and exactly how much cannabis, right? Which gets us back to all these same questions of timing and route and dose and everything too.
Yeah, yeah, that is it. Well, it's really helpful to see what, what we don't know, which is essentially what you're reinforcing here. But, from our perspective of trying to help make recommendations in terms of adverse events or precautions, it's helpful to, my hope is that right in Utah, they take on some of this, and trying to gather as much data, including, helping to sort out the chronic medical users versus the occasional users, and also the dosages that are used, as opposed to what's in the blood, what dosages are used. I mean, it sounds like if you're unfortunate, and you're a chronic user and you're in Utah and you have you have THC in your system, you're going to get pulled into the legal system. And to get out, you'd have to really probably spend quite a bit of effort and money trying to.
Yeah, I'm not sure how those have been litigated, because I know there is the exception if you're a Utah medical cannabis patient, but I think it gives you an affirmative defense, which means they can still charge you, but then the prosecutor might decide that it's not worth trying to go do all this unless you did something horrific, right? Where you blasted through a stoplight and killed 2 people or something like that, right?
Interesting.
So there is that stipulation. I haven't been involved in any of those cases. I do some legal work on interpreting things, either like alcohol and meth more often, because that's but I don't know how those cases are playing out in Utah.
Yeah, well, just complicated for all parties involved, and the more we can understand, the better. And I appreciate that you're putting this effort forward, Mike. Any other questions from the board or department?
I will also say that the issue that brought this up is the traffic fatality folks that kind of mentioned to us that we're seeing more cannabis, or they're seeing more cannabis in all of these accidents. To me, it's like, well, it's out there, but we also know cannabis use has just increased substantially. So is it an association? Is it causation? Is it just trending with more cannabis being out there? Are these drivers at fault? Are they just at higher risk for being involved in an accident with the cannabis present? What numbers are we actually measuring there? So a lot of unknowns with our Utah data, and will be kind of tough to get at that. And we're going to depend on other science that's being done elsewhere to help us interpret the information that we have. But hopefully I'll be able to start digging into the weeds with that group in the coming months to see. In the meantime, right, just about how many different prescription bottles has anyone had where someone slaps on a sticker on the side that says, use caution when operating heavy machinery or driving. And we don't even think twice about what the evidence is behind that for whatever other sedating medications. And there's a lot for THC, so a lot that's unknown. But people should be cautious. If you feel like you shouldn't drive, don't drive. That's probably a pretty basic, but honestly, a probably rational recommendation too. If you feel impaired, don't drive.
Yeah. Well, that's great. So I'm thinking, Rich, since Mike's not going to be at a meeting until January, maybe he can go on the agenda in January. I don't know if the meeting's early January or what, but we'll.
I think
let's do that.
First week or something like that. It's the first week of
Okay.
the
And
month,
then,
I believe.
Mike, let us know if there are developments before then, or information you'd want to share with us, and we can get you on the agenda.
I'm happy to dig deeper into any one of those particular topics as you guys had questions like, well, what about this or what about that? I'm like, yeah, I know. There's a lot we could have spent. We could do a whole journal club on any one of these papers and tear it apart and decide it, right? what fun that would be for everyone to watch. So if you guys have a request for one of those topics, I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, thank you. Let's move forward. Rich is going to talk about the general instructions that we put together a couple of years ago, or a year or so ago, for the use of medical cannabis. And this came up really as we kind of reviewed that annual report and saw that we made some very specific recommendations and want our efforts here to align with making progress in those areas that we listed as recommendations. And this document that Rich is going to share with us and go over relates to, you know, how we can create some safety in this medical program, starting with starting with the dosages. I know we've mentioned and discussed concerns about appropriate doses and ensuring that patients have access to that. And so we thought this would be worth bringing up and just reviewing. And for some of you who are new to the board, this document was created before you arrived. And for those of us who were involved, it's a good refresher. It was for me, at least. So go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, it was a good refresher for me as well, Katie. So what this does is it goes through what we call general instructions for use of medical cannabis. And it begins by talking about the storage. It talks about...
Actually, sorry, Rich, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Maybe you could just let us know where this is and where, what the context, and maybe even the top of this document. Just give us a little aerial view.
So would you scroll up to the top? This is a very long document, but yeah, thanks there, Rachel. So this was created in 2020, actually, as guidance on the suggested use of medical cannabis. One of the core duties of the Cannabis Research Review Board was for them to come up with this and to, with the group, do research. There was a ton of research that went into how this was put out. There was a lot of studies that were reviewed together by individual board members, and there was deliberation between board members about specific things. But one thing that we felt strongly about is obviously making this document something that its purpose was for providers in the program, but also patients and parents are welcome to use it as a resource as well, and the industry if they choose to. So there's yeah, so that kind of gives you the background of the purpose of the guidelines, and the board can make amendments to this to the suggested use guidelines at any time. And the way that it's formatted is this relates to, for all use of medical cannabis, this specific suggested use document. And then there is a document that is specific to each individual condition on the website. And in past meetings, if you've been a part of those, we've had the board make amendments and changes to those as new studies have been presented by Lauren Heath and others. And but this one is the overarching general document that gives some general guidance related to the responsible use of medical cannabis. Rachel, if you'll scroll down to just we can just focus on some of the content a little bit as you go through it. So go through slowly. This just gives an index of what's in there. So it talks about, page 7 is where we're going to go, that focuses specifically on general instructions, but beyond that, it goes over contraindications that are important, some general warnings and precautions and adverse reactions, cannabis drug interactions, and then we go through each of the state approved qualifying medical conditions in that. and some definitions. So if an entourage effects, obviously that's gone over as well. And if you'll just continue on there, Rachel. Great. So now we're to the general instructions and how to use the document. That item 2, that cites some research that is cited that was used in the drafting of this document. And if you notice, there's some familiar names on here, like Ethan Russo. That's someone that we've been able to cite in our documentation, and he's with Caroline McCollum put together some practical considerations in medical cannabis administration and dosing. That was published, and so these recommendations in large part are based on that, but also these other cited studies as well. So those are the 3 main studies that are research literature that these instructions are based on. So it goes without saying, but storage is always important to make sure it's stored in a safe place, especially if you have live in a home with children. And then it goes through how it's so important for providers to clearly communicate the potential risks of cannabis, just like they would do with any other psychoactive medication, especially those products with THC, obviously, are those that are psychoactive. And then if you'll scroll down a little bit more, then we get into starting dose guidance for those that are ingested. And so the key phrase that we repeat again and again is start low and go slow. That's not a surprise to anyone in this group, I know. Always good to emphasize that. And then it talks about some specific milligram amounts that are recommended for those individuals that are oral dosing. And if you continue to scroll down, then we get into item 5, which is dosing guidance for oral or sublingual administration.
Hold
of
on,
medical-
can you
Yeah.
back up, Rachel, to that? 'Cause I think this is really important, a little bit more backwards,
Sure.
a little more.
Yeah,
This is the only place in our entire kind of guidelines where we talk about dosage in specifics. Every other place, it's start low and go slow. And so I think the title of this is misnamed. It's not general instructions, it's instructions for use that applies to, generalized to every condition. And if you go down, so section C, it talks about how you would do the induction or the initiation of the cannabis and the increments for titration. We hope that these can be followed, and in order for them to be followed, qualified providers would have to have confidence that these increments are available to their patients. So I just want to say that. And then if you scroll down where it said most patients, back a little, sorry, Rachel, most patients dose orally 2 to 3 times per day. Consider the following regimen for daytime dosing. Now, if you could, yeah. So on day 5 or 6, it's saying increase as tolerated by 1 milligram to 2.5 milligram increments, administered 2 to 3 times per day, up to 15 milligram increments in a given day. And I just really want us to be aware that this is what we put out there. I think in my opinion, it gets lost because it's listed only once, unrelated to any condition, and it's titled general instructions.
and it's on page 9 of a 56-page document.
Yes. And so I really think we need to, I just wanted, Rachel, I wanted us to see this and hear this and ponder this part. It's hard, the way your screen is, it's pretty narrow. We only can see maybe a quarter of a page. So I really want the board to be able to follow along with what Rich is saying. So anyway, just wanted to say that. I think the board really it would be helpful if people had some suggestions in terms of how to make this more visible, more usable. You know, and you know, we need to understand how qualified providers might be using the bigger document, how they're accessing it, and linking them to these instructions. So go ahead, Rachel and Rich.
And I think one thing to keep in mind is we know there are providers that do document what their recommendations are or have some established recommendations that are similar to these that they would share with a patient. And also keep in mind that depending upon how much the individual has used the product in the past, used cannabis in the past, you know, these could be modified based upon that use, because if you've used a lot in the past, then you might need to start at a higher dose just to get that desired impact from the product. But over time, your provider and your pharmacist should be able to help that person decrease over time if they're needing to get that assistance. Because over time, the goal is that your consumption would decrease if possible. Yeah, so great. All right. So
So
yeah, go ahead.
Are these dosage forms even available in these strengths, or do they just get 20 milligrams and you're supposed to shave off a piece? And I think that's kind of something that was in our kind of annual report, right? As far as what strength are these being supplied as from medical cannabis dispensaries, and can people even adhere to these recommendations based on the available dosage strengths?
I think that's the exact question, Mike, and I would add to that, this section 5 talks about the THC to CBD ratios, and that all of the recommendations for dosing, regardless of what the condition is, it's not only, you know, we need these increments available to providers and patients that allow providers to follow the recommendations, and then stay within that 15 milligram maximal dose, you know, at least as a guideline. In addition, the products available have to be these 1 to 20 or high CBD or chemotype 3 products. So I think your question applies. That's exactly what I would like us to be communicating, you know, and because it makes no sense to make recommendations for dosage, which we were asked to do, and then have it, you know, learn that it's impossible to follow those recommendations. It's like asking someone to, you know, increase their furosemide by 1 milligram increment until effective, when it doesn't come in that dosage. So I don't need to make ridiculous analogies like that, but I think Mike's question is the question.
Right. And so I know that in some cases there would be a challenge for a patient to easily find these type of products. And what we can do is I can work with our research team and our data analyst on evaluating the inventories at the pharmacies today to identify what products would fit into this category that are currently in the program, and we can compare the volume of those products to other products and share that information with providers and share that with patients and also the industry, so they're aware of this issue. I think it's really important to do the analysis on that.
Rich and Catherine, just to add to that, not only is this important for dosing instructions in a clinical setting where I'm advising patients on how to use it and for their safety, if the additional reason is if we're ever going to get more research and quality research, we've got to have a consistent product and consistent guidelines. The fact that the guidelines and the products don't align is a problem that's even bigger. Because if we want more high quality research, and we're not going to get it if it's always a moving target.
Yeah,
If we ever have consistent product with consistent dosages and consistent availability, we're never going to get better research, period, right? So this is really important to standardize so that we can advance our medical knowledge. Otherwise, we're just floundering, chasing moving targets, whatever the producers want to produce, and it's just never going to happen. So that I want to emphasize that we're not going to move ahead unless we establish some of these standards.
Yeah. And I think, Matt, I think well said. I think, you know, you have a lot of experience right in the front lines here, and that's very meaningful. And I think, Rich, you know, maybe the department can work on how, not just to adjust the document. I think a simple adjustment, get rid of general instructions
mhm,
and embed this section either through a link or actually reproducing it throughout the document for every condition. Now, again, is anyone referencing this and looking at this? Is it easily accessed? I don't know, but those two revisions, I think, help this document. But I think what Matt is talking about and what Mike was implying is much more, you know, relevant and important than adjusting the document. I think it's how do we get this information to be standardized and practiced? That's really, you know, in order to, so we can continue to increase our knowledge and make recommendations, we need to have better research. And we can't have better research, you know, based on what Matt's saying. So I think it involves probably, again, our communication with the legislators as well as communication with the providers and patients.
and it would be a lot easier to do the research with changes to the federal law, moving cannabis to be a Schedule 2 rather than a Schedule 1 controlled substance that was just an executive recommendation that was made just recently.
And that's the biggest limitation that we face, and so does every single state trying to do this.
Mhm.
But I think short of that happening, and I'm hopeful that that will happen, it's just on what timeline, on whose timeline.
Right. We can't count on that timeline, but there's things we can do in the meantime.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
I think we've taken or lawmakers took a small step to appropriate some funding for some evaluation of patient experiences in Utah's medical cannabis program. And we look forward to that. We're finalizing the contract for the University of Utah to help us with that important project. And it could be that leads to other projects that the legislature may or may not be willing to fund in the future. Yeah.
Well, I think, Rich, if you can, you know, I like what you're saying, if the department can take this on and look at inventory and just learn whether it aligns in terms of dosage for incremental titrations, as well as ratios and chemotypes.
Right.
Those are the two things we just need to know. And I think, and then we bring that to whoever, you know, can use that information to either make changes or not make changes. But I think the message is, if we want it to be a medical program, changes probably have to be made depending on what is discovered.
Sure.
When inventory is kind of checked with these parameters. So that any more questions? I think this is a really important discussion and really aligns with what we've been talking about and the recommendations we made for in the annual report, as well as to the legislators.
Great.
It looks like no other questions.
Well, I'll
No.
just
Go ahead, Matt.
This sounds like a good segue into our next section of the agenda, because this information has been posted for quite some time, but you know, the water isn't getting to the end of the row, so to speak. You know, this has been available, but we still have a limitation in providers and utilization of this information. So
Yeah,
I was just gonna add, might be helpful if we could query some of the best practices that are using this document as they are taking care of their patients. That's kind of where the rubber meets the road. How is this document that we've prepared actually being implemented? And then
Yeah.
that would give us good feedback as to whether or not the document's really being helpful for those physicians in practice that want to alleviate pain or other needs, other uses of medical cannabis.
yeah, that's right, Brian. That would be helpful. And, you know, I think it may be helpful, but we may discover it's helpful for those who are actually using it. And there may be many who aren't aware that it exists or don't know how to access it, or and so, like Matt said, it may be inadequate, even if it is useful as written, in terms of public health outreach efforts that need to be done.
Mhm.
I see that Jennifer just raised her hand. Jennifer, do you want to speak?
Yeah, I just have a comment from being a qualified medical provider just for the last few years, and I was completely unaware of this document until it came up through the board. So if some of this information could be distilled into a smaller volume and put on the EVS website in a very obvious place, I think other QMPs could actually see it and not have to dig around for the information. It's very hard to navigate, I think.
Yeah,
Lauren, when you say EVS website, do you mean on our Center for Medical Cannabis website or within the EVS where the recommendations are being made? I just want to clarify.
I think the EVS website. I mean, I think that qualified medical providers don't go to our information. I think they use the EVS. They use it to, you know, recommend medical cannabis to patients, and so that's one less place they have to go to look. I mean, the easiest place that they can find information, somewhere they use, would be a better place to put this.
Yeah,
Does that make
Jennifer,
sense?
very
Yes,
much so.
thank you.
And I think that fits with what you were suggesting, you know, asking about if you can take a little deeper dive into the EVS and you know, improve it, and you know, you didn't necessarily bring this up, but this is exactly what I think you were getting at, that it's maybe it's underutilized in some way. And if we had this information, it's not underutilized. I don't mean that. We may be missing an opportunity for disseminating information by using it. That hadn't occurred to me. So I think that's brilliant. I appreciate your willingness to look at that. And, you know, I think it does need to be trimmed down. I think maybe, Jennifer, that's something you could look at of this. I think it's 2 pages that these instructions span. I think it could be distilled down to a paragraph or 2.
Be happy to do that. Try to trim it down to something that's useful, like to look at and easy on the website. Yeah,
That'd
I'll
be
look at
great,
that.
Jennifer.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. This is Sarah Pons. I can help you with that as well if you wanted to connect on that.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
So let's make sure that does get on the agenda for next month. And Jennifer, if you don't have time this next month, the following month, I know we all have a lot of stuff to accomplish between these meetings. So, but we just want to give you space for that. And I think it's important. So Sarah, thanks for helping to make that happen.
Okay, thanks.
Should we move, Rich, to Danielle?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Danielle, for talking to us about public health outreach efforts. And as Matt said, we nicely segued into your section of the agenda. Right on
Yes.
time, I may add.
Oh, perfect. Well, and I'm so sorry if you can hear my dogs playing with a squeaky toy in the background. They have the worst timing, I will say. But I just have two quick updates. So the first one is that we are still in the process of writing up a contract for a QMP consultant to help with outreach, particularly to other medical providers about the endocannabinoid system and medical guidelines for recommending and utilizing medical cannabis. And then the other update I have is just that I'm currently working on putting together a social media marketing campaign about medical cannabis, public health guidelines, and specifically about some of the same general public health guidelines that are outlined in the handouts that have been created and are on the website. But also some other information. For example, I'm working on including information about secondhand vapor and preventing that around kids. And after hearing Dr. Moss's information about medical cannabis and driving, I'll work on including that as well. So, and then as that's finalized, I'll continue to provide updates to the board of how it'll be disseminated, examples of the social media posts, things like that. That's all I have. Does anyone have any questions for me?
Thanks, Danielle. That's great. I would just ask Sarah and Jennifer it seems to make sense to me to have you possibly participate at some point in their efforts with the EVS. I think.
Oh, yeah.
I defer to them and you, Rich, but you're doing good work and we appreciate it and looking forward to getting to learning more about the position that you're creating for an advisor or consultant. Any questions from board or department for Danielle?
Your work.
I was wondering, Danielle, if that is going to be on like health department Facebook page, or where can we expect to see those channel updates once they go live?
Yes, so I will be working with the DHHS Public Information Office so that those will be posted on the DHHS general social media channels, Facebook and Instagram. And then we also will be sending those out to other partners as well. So other specific program, Facebook and Instagram pages, as well as partners like the Utah Patients Coalition and other stakeholders with social media that may be interested in providing this information.
Good, thank you. Okay, I think we can move back to you, Rich.
Great. So just a few items to update. We're close to finalizing a public bulletin that we want to send out regarding synthetic cannabinoid and they're used as ingredients in medical cannabis products in Utah. Those are a concern of the Utah Department of Health and Human Services and the Utah Department of Agriculture and Food. And there's a new law that requires that when a container or when a product contains a synthetic cannabinoid or a derivative cannabinoid, that those containers have a label that informs the patient purchasing that product that indeed the product does contain a synthetic cannabinoid. And so we want to ensure that patients have information about those labels. The pharmacies are responding to questions about those already, I know. And we felt it was important that DHHS sent out a public bulletin. So as a state agency, we can provide some helpful information to help them educate themselves about the products that they're purchasing. So that'll be going out soon. We had planned to send it out today, but we got some input that caused us to want to make some tweaks to it. We're getting some additional input, which is important. So we'll be sending that out soon. And when a final version of that is sent out, it'll also be on our website. and it'll also be shared with board members and with other stakeholders in the industry, along with medical cannabis cardholders. So that's something that will be happening soon. I would expect that to go out later this week. And then we do have a medical cannabis market analysis meeting scheduled for Tuesday, October 25th at from 4 to 5 p.m. And that'll be here at the Utah Department of Health and Human Services Mesa building. And the purpose of that meeting will be for DHHS and the Department of Agriculture and Food to get input from the public regarding the quality of medical cannabis products in the industry, also the supply and the variety of the products. And so we'll be posting some questions in the agenda that the public and the industry will be able to answer. If they choose to make a public comment during the meeting, great. If they just want to submit a written comment, that's fine too. And we're giving them the opportunity to submit those comments. This is the second market analysis input meeting that we're having. We did one last month, and so this is the second in the series of two that we're doing. But this medical cannabis market analysis is something that's required that the Department of Health do with help from the Utah Department of Agriculture and Food on an annual basis. So also, we're working on some rules related to the delivery of medical cannabis to healthcare facilities. And that is something that is a new part of the law. And we want to be able to get help from healthcare facilities and drafting up those standards. There is not a requirement that healthcare facilities allow a patient to store medical cannabis or to have medical cannabis delivered or possess medical cannabis, or for a facility to administer medical cannabis. Although some facilities are doing that, and we want those facilities to be able to, under state law, have some general standards that they can comply with when they have those. And it may be that the law or the rule is written in a way that just refers them to their own standards that they would set up, similar to what they have with other controlled substances when they need to protect those and distribute those and administer those. Is kind of what we're thinking would just be similar for medical cannabis. So, and then we're just preparing for the 2023 legislative session. There's several amendments to the law that we expect to happen. And so we're evaluating those possible changes. And we've talked about some of those in the past, but so I won't take too much time. But also the new medical cannabis pharmacy in Price is scheduled to open later this month. And that'll be the 15th medical cannabis pharmacy located in Utah. Looks like there might be some hands up. I don't know if those are new or if those have been around for a while. But
No,
I'm happy to
they are
answer any
new. I think,
questions.
yeah, Jennifer
Great.
and Mike. Jennifer, do you want to go ahead? Maybe that was a mistake. How about Mike? You want to go ahead?
Yeah, my question was on the synthetic cannabinoid labeling. To me, as toxicologist, synthetic cannabinoid means spice, these illicit compounds that are, sold as fake weed. What is the compound specific that we're assuming this is going to apply to, that this is extracted, purified Delta 8, but that's not exactly synthetic, or
Right.
what are we thinking this refers to as far as synthetic cannabinoids?
I think we're also including analogs, correct?
Right. So it's a synthetic or a derivative ingredient, and those are chemically created from materials other than natural ingredients. That's how we define a synthetic cannabinoid in the law. And then a derivative cannabinoid is any ingredient that has been intentionally created using a process to convert a naturally occurring ingredient to another ingredient. So what we also know is that some of these are appearing unintentionally. And there's a manufacturing process that obviously these products go through, and as concentrates, that process uses different cutting agents, and Sometimes that process is cleaner than, or less clean than it should be. And sometimes when a company, a processor processes a product, they may be unaware that a Delta 10 or a Delta 6 THC cannabinoid is in there until they have the Utah Department of Agriculture and Food do testing. And then that testing comes up and shows that there is indeed some Delta 10 or Delta 6 THC in there, in addition to the other products that were showing up in the analysis that the company originally did. And so the law changed to require that whenever there's a presence of a synthetic or a derivative cannabinoid, that there be a label placed on the container that informs the patient of that synthetic or a derivative ingredient being contained in the product. And there's a lot we don't know about these synthetic ingredients. Some of them are intentional, like I said, but others are not unintentional. And this is a concern across the United States. It's not just in Utah. And the lawmakers felt so strongly about it that they wanted to ensure that there was a label that informed patients about this. So other states don't, they often will require that the label in fine print indicate that there was a Delta 8 or a Delta 6 or a Delta 10 in there that was synthetic. But they don't clearly state in other states that it is a synthetic. They could just say it's a Delta 6 or a Delta 10. But if it's a Delta 6 or a Delta 10 or a Delta 8, it is highly probable that it is a synthetic, because these compounds do not exist naturally in the amounts that they're showing up in products. It would have to be a synthetic or a derivative. So Utah's law is a bit unique in that it does require that there's this label that shows up so patients know. Patients can choose to not purchase the product and only purchase products that have naturally occurring cannabinoids, or they could choose to purchase the product that has the label that provides them that information. The health effects of these synthetic cannabinoids, as you would expect, have not been adequately studied. And that's why the Utah Department of Agriculture and Food and the Department of Health and Human Services have concern. And so we do encourage patients to use these products with caution, to consult with their medical provider about them before they use them. And the lawmakers could take additional action in the future during the 2023 session regarding these products that have the synthetic cannabinoids. But that gives you, I think, a description of why the labels are required and why we feel so strongly about them, and why we want to send out a public notice, a public bulletin about it, so patients can be better informed about those type of products. So that's what that relates to.
Does that, Mike, address your questions?
Yeah, no, perfect. That's very helpful. Certainly purity and safety are kind of first steps on the checklist for any sort of medical product.
Yeah. Any other questions?
And we know there's some public comments on that topic, and we can get to those, Katie, at the end when you're ready.
Okay. Yeah. I've just thought before that I want to make sure that any board members or department staff weigh in, or if they need further clarification from Rich, let us know. And I think we're almost ready for that public comment. I think, Rich, I'm glad you mentioned that. I think sometimes some of the comments may come up in this meeting, but the board really isn't able to respond. They may have more to do with department issues. So if that's the case, maybe Rich, you can, at the end of the comment section, just remind people to send you an email or send the program an email. And then the information can be gathered and a response can be made.
Great.
I'll ask while we have time, Rich, you in the Department of Ag are gonna have that meeting where they'll have public comment on the dispensaries and the products available and the variety.
Uh-huh.
And that term variety has just been swimming around my head. I imagine that there might be a desire for a variety of products and these types of things. But again, I'll reiterate what I mentioned earlier. The more variety we have, the harder it is to study and to have well-defined protocols, because to have quality research, we've got to isolate more variables and have more of a consistent product. And I don't know what the industry, they obviously probably have to compete and find ways to distinguish their products, and it's maybe a bit ironic that the more variety and the more competition we have, the harder it is to research and to have consistency, which is what we would want. And I know that's the way medicine has been. It's kind of boring, in a lot of sense, but you have to have consistent products. And when I counsel my patients, I tell them, look, other medicines, we have dose and frequency, that's it. But in cannabis, you have dose, frequency, and route, and strain, hybrid versus sativa or indica, and then you have the ratio of the different products. So you have 5 different variables. When you have 5 variables, it's really hard to study and to get consistent feedback from patients. And so I just wonder if that's going to be a topic when we talk about the variety of products and the products that are available, and how it relates to our mission of advancing research and medical knowledge. So just to reiterate that.
Yeah, that's a good comment, Matt. That's a factor for sure. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a critical part. I kind of see that maybe with the, if the department is able to conduct kind of an inventory review, that I think that we would see kind of, is that variety, what is the degree of that variety, and can that be altered in any way to help ensure that the program survives, and that that the research can be done that allows for a medical program.
And I agree, Katie. And I don't know if you remember the first time we tried to do the formulary, this is the issue that we ran into when we were trying to compare apples to orangutans. There's no standard cannabis equivalent dosage like you have with other medications like opioids.
Yeah.
So that's something that does make it very difficult when you're comparing these medication, these forms, cannabis.
Yeah. It's kind of where the phase 1, phase 2 studies are being conducted in the after rollout. So it's very backwards. There was no dosage guidelines, and nothing that could align with what Matt is saying, that normally is established before a medicine is available to humans. Dose and some sort of standardized measurement of what's in the product. So yeah, I know, Sarah, and I think we should revive what you and Jesse did at some point. I think that we put that on hold because of what you learned, and I think that needs to get revived and revisited, just like we revisited the instructions for use. That in this light, given what we know now, it may have a lot more meaning. But if nothing else, I think, Sarah, to refresh our memories on that would be really helpful.
Yeah, we can take a look at that. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we're still ahead of schedule. Anything else from the board or staff? All right, so we normally would be starting public comments at 10:30. Since it's 10:20, maybe we will be able to wrap up 10 minutes early. Let's try to do that, since we got through this agenda with 10 minutes to spare. So let's take those 10 minutes off the end of our meeting. Rachel, should I just remind people of the process?
Yeah, go ahead and do just a quick reminder.
Okay, real quickly, just state your name. Well, Rachel, I'm going to assume you collected the hands up. Just state your name, any disclosures, and affiliations, and we will be listening to the comments back to back without response in between. And then and Rachel, I'm going to depend on you to make sure we leave enough time for response. But I think it's most important that people get to at least voice their 2-minute comments.
Yes. So if you have a question, if you are a board or staff person who hears a question from anyone, please make just a quick note that you'll respond after we've concluded the public comment period so that we can hear as many comments as possible. With that, I'm going to call on Christine. Christine, you have 2 minutes starting now.
Thank you so much. I want to start off right off the bat saying, Mike Moss, thank you so much for that presentation. It was wonderful and accurate in what Truce has been trying to articulate for some time. Oh, and I forgot to make that announcement. My name is Christine Stenquist. I'm the president of Truce. I have no financial gain in this. Just want to make sure the community is represented. A few comments that I wanted to make to the standardization problem. We have 426 compounds in this botanical with a major varieties across the board. The reason why we have state medical programs is because this cannot be standardized yet. And we're not going to be moving anytime quickly on the federal level. I've been doing this for a decade. And every election cycle, I have heard from politicians that they're going to reschedule this. So I feel like we just need to I need to set the board's expectations on what they can actually accomplish. And maybe they need to go back to the legislators and let them know that some of the things they're asking you to do is really futile at this point, because we don't have those standardizations. The other thing that I would really caution on that too is we don't have quality product in our state currently, going to the point that Rich is articulating, and I applaud the state in trying to help manage this current situation where we have contaminants. These aren't cannabinoids, they're not natural. These are degradants that are in our products right now. That is the Delta 6, Delta RS situation, Delta 10 situation that we're having. That is a problem that needs to be handled before you can really talk about patients and the dosing and the quality. Going to the dosing situation, that is in itself in a whole entire conversation. I am a chronic user. I have been for a decade.
Christine, that's time. Thank you so much for your comment. We are going to go ahead and go to Zach now. Zach, your time starts now.
Hi, I'm also a patient. I've been struggling with chronic pain for about 25 years and been a cannabis patient for that long.
Zach, can you state your name and any affiliations?
I am a plumber and I occasionally do volunteer service for Truce if I can. But yeah, I'm just a patient. I don't have any interest in this other than to have access to the medicine that I need to survive. I hope that we can get to the point to where we focus more on organic medicine versus these synthetic options. I really appreciate the fact that you're pushing for more standardization, but patients like me are struggling to survive. And I think the biggest thing we can focus on is ways that we can have more access to this medicine instead of less. I heard they're taking away the liquid suspension, which would be very beneficial to me. Unfortunately, the cost is too high. And so if we could get to the point to where these costs are lower so patients can afford their daily formulary, whatever it is, whether it's 100 milligrams or 5 or whatever, we're just struggling, guys. So whatever you can do to get to the point to where patients like me can actually have our daily medicine and know that it's safe and know that it's organic and know the terpene percentages and know if they're botanical or cannabinoids or cannabis derived. Sorry, I'm fighting a lot of chronic fatigue. But if we were able to actually get all of the access that we need in the bioavailability to where we can deal with our pain like me and Christine deal with every day, that would be huge. My wife passed away from an Ambien interaction, and natural medicine could have saved her life. And I just want to try to find ways that we can have all safe access for everyone without money, without all these pharmaceutical issues, and to just have a safe option. I yield my time. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Zach. We're going to go to Valerie now.
Hi, my name is Valerie Ahananu. I am a chair with vice chair with Truth, but I also work in clinical pharmacology and have ran clinical studies with plant-based medicines in psychiatry and neuroscience related issues, as well as oncology research. And I also work in clinical integration work, doing holistic integration to work with patients to look at their health as well as the medicines that they're taking, and how to create an actual program for themselves that doesn't require addiction or anything like this. So I work quite deeply within this space, and not just on the cannabis side, but I also work with actual pharmaceutical medications. And so part of what I wanted to go into was the dosing, as well as how that influences the presentation we saw with driving and some of the derivatives. I think all of this kind of goes into one beautiful conversation, in that the real reason the DEA and FDA are so focused on this and also giving us the option to have medical cannabis is because of the safety profile of cannabis in comparison to the rest of our drugs that are made and distributed through labs. It's quite important that we consider dosing to be something that is individual. As Christine mentioned, there are 426 different botanicals in this plant that we use all very differently, and everyone's endocannabinoid system is different. So I want to promote Utah to utilize the research that has been done up until this point to then further it so that we can get more specific for our population, rather than for us to, as much as I want to praise you guys, that was a beautiful guide for dosing. Nobody will use that, not because it's not great, but it's actually just the standard researched dosing that we have up until this point. So it's actually going to be great for us to use our EVS data, use some of the patients that are coming to this, and begin to kind of come together to create individualized care.
Thank you, Valerie.
Hopefully that's our
That
goal.
is 2 minutes. We so appreciate your comment. I'm going to go to Jake now, if Jake is still interested in commenting. If not, that's totally fine.
I did hear a bias that left me uncomfortable. The statements like the goal is to reduce dosage over time, or the goal is to standardize what is a living organism. These types of goals are more in line with pharmaceutical, man-made, manufactured products. I'd like to recognize that pushing this towards that has left a lot of man-made problems on what is a plant that works great when people grow it for themselves. That's it.
Thank you, Jake. We're going to go to Mark Viner now. Mark, you have 2 minutes.
Hi, Dr. Viner, Utah licensed physician, but I practice psychiatry in Nevada, private practice, no affiliations or financial problems. Okay, but one idea about the synthetic cannabinoids, when I'm writing academic work, I've decided to come up with 2 types. There's the traditional synthetic cannabinoids, the JW, blah, 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 all those really ones that we studied. And then I've come up with the idea of hemp-derived THC. That's a second type, or a phase 2, a second type of synthetic cannabinoid. it, you gotta make sure it's labeled. But any THC derived from hemp should be considered a synthetic cannabinoid. And some of them don't just go by TCHO, TCHP, or T delta 8, delta 10. What about HHC, the one made with explosives? So I think we should try to come up with a better classification scheme for synthetic cannabinoids. Mine is traditional and then hemp derived, because they're all over the hemp derived THC, because your crops are now becoming separate. There's hemp crops and high THC crops now. So that's going to be a problem. All right, number 2 is the dosing. At Yale, to do sex studies, they use 1.25 milligrams IV THC. IV. Now, that's ridiculous, but what is the dose equivalent in a cigarette or a vaporizing? So my scheme for dosing is to have a whole section on different routes of administration and dosing for those routes. And then you want to use for each disorder, like the section 5.
Mark,
you
I'm so
just
sorry to
quoted
cut
it.
you off. Sorry,
I'm
that
sorry.
is 2 minutes though,
Right.
but I welcome your comment. And if you'd like to email the conclusion of your thoughts, you're welcome to. I put the email in the
Right,
chat
sorry.
earlier. I'm going to go to Amy King. Amy, would you like to make a comment? And please
Yes,
state
good
any
morning.
affiliations you might have.
Yes, good morning. My name is Amy Case King, and I'm an advisor to Truce. And I'm a member of ASTM, which is one of the largest voluntary standards developed organizations in the world. And they have currently and have been working for 4 years to develop cannabis standards. We have a subcommittee known as the Government Relations, and I'd love to see more of your board members and members of the Department of Health and the USDA, or your Department of Agriculture, join and attend these meetings. I think that while it's great that you're trying to come up with standards, there's an organization that you can work with to develop those to benefit all of the people who are consuming medical cannabis, so that we have continuity in the science and what's being put into the market for safety. And with all of that in mind, my question is, this bulletin that you're going to put out, will it indicate that the state of Utah law requires testing to ensure, by quoting, the product is safe for human consumption, along with accurate labeling, and that no Utah department or agency has ensured the safety of these permitted analogs? So in lieu of indicating that these constituents are there, will there be an element that says the product contains semi-synthetic or synthetic components or processes? That's the end of my comment.
Thank you, Amy. We should be able to get an answer for you in just a moment. Kristen, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. My name's Kristen Larson. I'm just a patient here in Utah. It's been really fascinating to sit in on these meetings and somewhat frustrating to come in as just a patient without much background, but I'm really grateful for all of the background work that's being done in our behalf. I think that the biggest frustration for me as a patient is, like we've been talking about, the safety and the purity. I just bought some cannabis. The harvest date was in May. I didn't get it till October. So that's a 5-month turnaround, which is just really hard from a perspective of the plant is losing its value over that time. And so my question to you, and I hope what we can also move toward, is having the right to grow this plant in our own yards and having the autonomy and the responsibility for our own bodies to make the choice of what strain is best, what dosage is best, because this is not a pharmaceutical. You can't even compare it. And I appreciate the testing to wield out all of these chemicals, but at the same time, until we can grow this plant in our own very own gardens, it takes away a lot of our autonomy. There's a lot of bureaucracy. There's a lot of all of that kind of stuff. And I appreciate the efforts, but as a patient, it's very frustrating to not have the right legally to treat my body the way it needs to be healed. That's all I have.
Thank you so much, Kristen. And I actually just missed a couple of affiliations. So if you're willing to, Jake, did you have any affiliations or financial ties? If you're still on, Jake, feel free to message me in the chat or speak up. And then let's see. And then Valerie, I was wondering if you could state the research or pharmaceutical company that you work for.
I do not currently work for a pharmaceutical company. I worked for MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, as their clinical operations manager. So yeah. And then I currently also work at Terra Health and Wellness as a holistic integration specialist.
Thank you so much.
And I have no financial interest in anything. And I am also vice chair for Truce.
Thank you
and I
so
work
much,
with
Valerie.
Decriminalize Nature Utah as a board member as well in their research team.
Okay. Jake, was
Thank
that
you.
you chiming in there?
Yeah, I'm a member of the public. My name is Jake Garn from Layton, Utah, distant relative of the senator, and a high interest in seeing this get to people that need it. A high interest, a very high level interest.
Thank
No
you so much,
financial
Jake.
interest whatsoever.
Thank you so much. All right, so now we're going to open it up for the next 10 minutes or so for response from DHHS board and CRRB, or sorry, CRRB board members and DHHS staff.
Yeah, so I just took a few notes, and one of the questions was about related to I think there was a question about what is the Department of Health and the state of Utah doing to ensure that patients are aware of what's in their products. And I think it was something to that effect. And so the labels that we were discussing earlier, those will indicate whether or not a particular product has a synthetic or a derivative cannabinoid contained within it. So patients already have that ability to see those labels, and if a patient notices that a particular product does have a Delta 8 or Delta 10 or Delta 6 or other derivative or analog or synthetic cannabinoid in the ingredients, and that it does not have a label specifically saying that it is a synthetic, please report those to the Department of Health and Human Services or to the Department of Agriculture and Food, and we will take a look at that, because that is the current law that they are required to have those labels. And then Kristen Larson, you had mentioned your feelings about getting the right to grow, and that is a topic that the DHHS and Utah Department of Agriculture and Food don't have authority over. What you're welcome to do is to reach out to lawmakers, and you could share your thoughts with them. That's where the authority to do something about the right to grow or for yourself would go. So Rachel, did I cover what I needed to? Is there any other questions that came up that we need to cover?
I think just some clarification came through in the chat just now to me. So asking in the bulletin that will be released, will it indicate that the law requires testing to ensure the product is safe for human consumption, along with the accurate labeling?
So the public notification that's going out, it'll include an indication that all medical cannabis products produced in Utah are tested for a variety of substances known to be harmful. And if a substance known to be harmful to a patient is tested, if a product tests positive for that, then obviously it's a product that is not sold and doesn't go through and is sold. But the labeling is placed on all of those products that do have a synthetic cannabinoid contained within it. So a patient would be aware that a particular product has that type of an ingredient contained within it. So I think that those were the items that I thought of. Board members, if you have any additional thoughts, you're also welcome to share those. But seeing none, I think we're ready to close.
I'll just
Go
chime
ahead.
in one more time, Rich.
Yeah.
Sorry. I really appreciate hearing the patient's comments, you know, those that attend these meetings that have experience as a patient. I learn a ton from my patients' feedback. That's in the absence of research, that's how we learn, and that's how I practice, is based on the feedback. And so that's very, very valuable. And I really liked the comment, I think, Valerie, about individualized care, because I believe that is really important, especially in my practice in primary care, is individualized care, because people are different. And this is a big area for this type of treatment. That's really important. And I described the dilemma earlier about how do we standardize to the point, like Dr. Viner was talking about, how do we standardize to the point where we can communicate and talk about things. The language that we use and the labels that we use is important. So how do we do that, but at the same time recognize that this isn't like Pepto-Bismol, where it's like, that's it. You know, this is very individualized treatment, and the types of products and the quantities, the dosages is very individualized and needs to be, and it makes it harder to talk about. So I think the dilemma has been well identified. And that's what makes it challenging. And to that point, we're not going to be able to compare this to drugs in the past. And like someone said, pharmaceuticals, this isn't, you know, it's really hard to compare to traditional pharmaceuticals, because it's a plant that's grown and evolves over time. And so these comments are all very, very useful. And I think that this type of group is the one that's going to figure out, well, how do we proceed from here then? How do we go, where do we go from here? In this very difficult dilemma. And ultimately, I think all of us really, you know, in primary care especially, I'm passionate about ultimately the care of my patients, the priority, right? And I think we all can agree that getting people help is the priority, and how we do that is going to be very complicated. But I just wanted to say I appreciate everyone's comments.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And I think that's what we kind of identified when we were trying to do the formulary, is that we were missing that key piece as to what the patients are, how they're actually using that cannabis. And I think that's why we're making some recommendations that we'll be able to gather more information in our database so that we can identify that a little bit easier, as to Valerie's point, and use our available data to see how things are actually being used and what's working for patients.
Yep.
Yeah, well said, Matt. Thank you. Anything else from the board? Okay. I think we are ready to wrap up, Rich.
Great.
Motion.
Anyone want to make a motion to close the meeting?
I'll motion with a thanks to all. I would motion that we adjourn.
I'll second that.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Meeting is
Thank
adjourned.
you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.